Welcome to Sustainability Now, an exploration of technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for socially conscious entrepreneurs and individuals interested in responsible stewardship of the planet. Sustainability Now covers food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. I'm your host, Mira Rubin, and today I am delighted to introduce you to Hal Crimmel. Hal is a Brady professor and chair of English and the chair of interdisciplinary arts and humanities programs at Weber State University in Utah. Hal focuses on interdisciplinary environmental humanities and has published 6 books on topics ranging from field-based teaching to water and air quality issues in the state of Utah, including Desert Water, the Future of Utah's Water Resources, and Utah's Air Quality Issues, Problems, and Solutions. He wrote and directed The Rights of Nature, a Global Movement, a documentary which was filmed on location in 2018 with co-directors Maria Valerio Berros and Isaac Gukaretz. The film has screened on 5 continents with over 400,000 views of the English and Spanish language versions on YouTube. Hal, I am so delighted to speak with you. Welcome, welcome. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mira. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. I discovered you because of your film, of your documentary, Rights of Nature. And we have so much to talk about around, there's so many topics, but let's get started with the film, because I think that's it's gaining in momentum, the awareness of and popularity of this notion about rights of nature. Can you just talk a little bit about it? What is it?
The film. So the film we first released in 2018, and we screened it at one of Germany's largest film festivals called DocFest in Munich. And since then we've done sort of the film the film circuit. Now mostly we do screenings for NGOs, community organizations, universities, and so forth. We just did one last night here in Salt Lake City for a group called Save Our Great Salt Lake. I've got a great poster over here. I could dart over and get it, but and they have adopted as their approach to trying to get water into Great Salt Lake the rights of nature idea. And so we had a good turnout, a lot of discussion. We've learned that despite some of the really positive legislative developments in 2022 that are going to allow the lake to have a right to have water. The largest industry, Magnesium Corporation of America, is filing a permit to dig a trench that will be 9 feet deeper than their current water intake for minerals. And organizations are very concerned that is going to further lower the lake levels. And so you mentioned the film has momentum. It really does. I think that more and more people, groups, communities, tribes, municipalities, when they learn of this idea, they think and ask, how could we make that work in our community? And so that has really been fun to have play a small role in and get close to groups that are really doing the hard work on the ground to ensure that, for instance, all this great work that we've done in terms of not we, but meaning me, but that I think that the state has done could be undercut by a large corporation who certainly contributes to the economic economics here in Utah, but also there are significant environmental consequences if the lake level drops further. So that's a bit of an overview.
Well, thank you for that. And let's just give a bit of background on the rights of nature movement, because I don't know that everybody is familiar with it. And it is a rather, although it seems like an obvious perhaps idea, it's rather revolutionary, very different from the existing paradigm. So how would you characterize rights of nature and the rights of nature movement?
Okay, yeah. I would say, I mean, we talk about this in the film, that an American law professor by the name of Christopher Stone, who was at USC, he wrote an article in 1972 called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And this was like to the best of my knowledge, the most influential article that sort of planted this notion, at least here in the United States, we're talking about, that a river or a mountain should have the right to sue on its behalf in the same way that individuals have that right. And so, it's certainly been a long time coming, since 1972. That was 50 years ago.
50 years ago.
So, so it's interesting to see how that idea has percolated throughout the legal community in this country and through community organizations. Now, the idea certainly has been around much longer than that in indigenous communities, probably for millennia, and certainly for centuries, both here in North America and in South America. And I think that the more recent rights of nature movement, sometimes called, if we're speaking of South America, the Pachamama movement, originated in Ecuador and Bolivia. When Ecuador put the rights of nature into its constitution, and Bolivia did as well. And so, because both those countries have very large indigenous populations with significant political power, that was able to happen at that national level. And so I think that because you have such a significant percent of the population, say in Ecuador, that for them it's not something that they have to think of as the rights of nature or the idea of Pachamama as a new idea. It's something that is just intrinsic to their worldview that they have grown up with, say. So I think that sort of establishes a broader theme of the film, and I think the rights of nature movement globally, insofar as that idea can be translated into different contexts depending on how a community feels it could best work.
Well, it's, on first blush, people might, in the Western culture, people might recoil from the notion of rights of nature, like that's crazy. But just to give it some context, we give corporations rights like human rights. And why should business be able to have that kind of standing when the world that we depend upon, that we are intimately integrated into, doesn't have those rights? So I think that helps to contextualize this for people that might be rattled by the notion, to say, well, wait a second, we've given business rights. Why wouldn't we give nature rights? And it's such an interesting mind shift. And I think that in our conversation, you mentioned that it was a big mind shift for you as well, to start being able to wrap your head around this. Ultimately makes tremendous sense. What shifted for you on a fundamental level that allowed you to have a recognition of the validity and the importance of this kind of approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wonderful comment. Let me just very briefly speak to the comment. with respect to the corporations having legal rights. So when that idea didn't exist, I'm a little not clear on the exact date, but I want to say sometime between 1890, maybe in 1910. And at the time, that was actually a radical notion. And there are a number of advocates who said, let's take this all the way up to the Supreme Court and see if the idea will stick. And it did. And so that hasn't, of course, for people who weren't born in 1900, that's just something we grew up with and we take for granted. And so that's a really useful parallel between thinking of not just how the rights of nature idea, say, in an industrialized country like the United States, could perhaps take root, but it's also sort of a reminder of how these new ideas come along and they become just established as the status quo. Another brief note is that in the film, one of the attorneys that we interviewed in Ecuador talks about that sometimes people will say, well, how can you give nature a legal right? Because nature cannot present itself in court to defend itself. But his point is that a human baby, has all the rights of personhood that an adult does, but a baby can't show up in court and present a written document and speak on its behalf in court. And so we have a guardian to do that, typically a parent, but not always. And so let's see, your question, I think I lost the thread of your question.
The question was for you personally.
Yeah.
What changed?
I think for me, I'd always just felt, it always bothered me personally when I felt that whether you want to call them ecosystems, nature, whatever, was degraded, whether it was a river, a forest, whatever it was, it always really deeply bothered me. Maybe, I don't know if it's fair to say, but in the same way that I would feel if I felt a person's rights were being violated. Almost, I guess I've always been sort of a fan of the underdog. And so I'd say a combination of my inclination toward wanting to support the underdog, my sense of feeling that it was just wrong to mistreat nature. But it never had a sort of a label for it, a word, a movement behind it. And so when I heard this, I felt, boy, that really fits with my worldview. I just didn't have a movement behind it to sort of contextualize, I guess, if you would, that worldview.
Yeah. It's interesting because the way that we respond to new ideas is first with maybe dismissal. Mm-hmm. And then if that idea continues to persist, then, maybe it sort of becomes like an earworm, where you just, it keeps noodling around until there's a part of our being that somehow shifts in being able to receive that possibility. I think that one of the big outgrowths of this rights of nature movement is a much deeper recognition of our connection with nature, and that an affirmation of the rights of nature is really an affirmation of our right to that connection and to life.
That's a wonderful point. I had never thought of it that way, but that's truly a wonderful point. I mean, the research, of course, in conjunction with environmental justice, shows that exposure to nature can do everything from helping children to do better in school, to reducing crime, instilling a sense of pride in a community, and so forth. And so I think your comment is exactly right on the mark, that I feel that when if a natural, again, these terms are also loaded, right? But I was going to say a natural resource, because that implies thinking of it in terms of a commodity. But let's just say that when a natural resource gets degraded, you're exactly right. It's stealing something people. And an example of this is, I think we see this in coastal communities all over the world, including in the United States, where maybe you had a beach that was either public space or just land that people could go to, and if they wanted to have a cookout with their family on the weekend, they could do that. And then all of a sudden that land was purchased and the access eliminated, and a big hotel put up, and now the local people have nowhere to go. That has made me very conscious about what it means to be a tourist these days. I mean, Utah is a state with an enormous tourism industry, and so I sort of see that from the other side, both as a local, but then when I go someplace as a tourist, and I feel that idea of nature as this sort of income producing commodity is something that I feel guilty because I'm certainly a consumer of that, but it's made me really question the ways in which these resources can be taken away, but even worse, let's say completely destroyed. I mean, a river that was once free flowing gets put in a canal, or cap, as they call it, right? Put in a concrete pipe and underground. And a lot of communities around the country are trying to daylight their creeks and rivers, meaning they take that waterway out of the concrete culvert and bring it back up to the surface. And when they do that, they find it's a gathering place for people, for plants, animals, birds. It creates more walkable cities that in turn benefit people in all the ways that you talked about and we just mentioned a couple minutes ago.
I do think that we're talking about a very different relationship to our natural world. And that's what this is really about. When you first started talking, you were talking about the Great Salt Lake, mm-hmm. and this corporation that is digging a trench that will lower the water capacity of the lake. And that brings me to the question, while states are implementing legislation to support rights of nature, how do we actually enforce that? How do we utilize these declarations and make them into something that actually has impact in the world?
Yeah. Boy, that's a hard question. I think one of the challenges is that, for instance, what the Utah legislature did this year, there were two House bills that were passed, and I think these are very, very powerful. One is going to allow the existing water rights holders to lease their water rights to the lake for the purposes of being in the lake. And previously that wasn't possible because water law requires what is called beneficial use, meaning it's being used for irrigation, it's being used for industry and so forth. And so as one of the folks we interviewed in the film says, prior to 2022, there was no mechanism to just let water just sit in the lake for the purposes of the lake. And so, I 48 hours ago, I was extremely optimistic about the attention that the lake has received and the opportunities now for willing sellers to have a willing buyer, conservation organization, and put this water back into the lake. But then last night at the film event, we had a representative from Heal, Utah, which is one of the major conservation organizations here, who explained about the Magnesium Corporation of America's proposal. And the issue is that there's such a patchwork of laws. So there's the question of the state's clean water laws. Would doing this violate those clean water laws? Yes or no? And then let's just say it does. There are also federal regulations that apply to this. One of them being that the plant is I believe the only source of magnesium in the country. And in that regard, it's essential. It's considered essential considered essential to defense industries, to the metal industries. So magnesium apparently is in everything from steel to a can that's canned food. And so there's that question of, would the government then, even if all the boxes were checked off that this proposal would say violate clean water statutes and so forth, at the state level, would the federal government's rules trump that and say, because this is so important to national interests, we're going to let the project proceed anyway? So I think one of the key pieces for rights of nature is, and when you look at people who are involved in it, they're often attorneys, smart people who have devoted their careers to environmental issues, and know how to navigate the complexities of the local, federal, state laws and regulations, because it often, what seems on the surface to be a very clear cut, this should happen. The way the legal system is structured, it's not quite so clear cut.
It's so interesting because all I'm hearing is priorities. And for so long, our priorities have been skewed toward business, toward extraction, toward productivity, in big air quotes, and not toward longevity, not toward regeneration, not toward sustainability. And we live on a very short-term kind of time frame, as opposed to indigenous peoples who are looking at 7 generations and the impact of our actions. And I'm wondering, we also tend to see things in black and white. And so in this particular instance, I'm wondering if there's maybe another way for them to accomplish what they need without digging this 9-foot deeper trench that would jeopardize the lake. Maybe they can be convinced to find another solution. It's not black and white, like it either goes or it doesn't go. What about coming up with a solution that respects the other needs and preserves both and instead of either or, which is another radical shift of paradigm, I think, for us.
Yeah, that question in a slightly different form came up last night. Namely, the question was, could an engineering team find a different way to draw that water without this new trench? And so I think the interesting piece about the Salt Lake is that the minerals industry is a $1 billion a year industry. And so that has always been touted as, on one hand, a reason to preserve the lake, because without water in the lake, you don't have that minerals industry anymore, because the minerals are produced through evaporation ponds. So no water, no evaporation ponds, no more minerals. It's not that the minerals are in the lake bed. The minerals are in the water. And yet at the same time, the estimated cost, not just if the lake completely dries up, but even if the lake dries up further, and even maybe if it remains at the same level, is estimated to be in the billions of dollars, because of the health costs, the toxic air pollution that will result from these waste minerals that have been pumped into the lake over decades, and now they're in the lake bed. And it wasn't such a problem when they were covered by water. It's a similar situation to, there's a General Electric plant, I believe, in either Schenectady or Albany. And for decades, they had been pumping PCBs into the Hudson River. And the question then became, this is sometime in the last 5 or 10 years, was it better to just leave that layer of sediment on top of that contaminated sediment? Or would it be better to dredge it and take those PCBs out? But at the same time, anytime there's dredging, you're going to have stuff then floating downstream. And so the water in the lake is in effect a sort of a cap on that potential airborne pollution. And without water in the lake, the cost will be absolutely astronomical. And so there's also this sort of interesting tug of war between what would be what's the benefit of continuing the minerals industry versus the cost, just the pure environmental cost of having these toxic minerals become airborne and blowing over a metropolitan region of 2 million people. So that's an interesting new piece. And I think that has been, for better, for worse, one of the impetuses for trying to do something quickly and significantly to save the lake.
Well, the interesting thing is that that's still a very narrow view, because we don't know what the impact is of losing that water sink, of having that area that has water on the climate itself, on the aquifers, on the soil, on farming. There are much more far-reaching impacts to much more far-reaching consequences that we're not even evaluating, that we're not looking at the big enough picture. We're looking at the immediate. The lake is the issue, but the lake is part of a greater ecosystem. And I think that that's really what we're talking about, is recognizing that there is a much larger context to all of these issues that we're facing as humanity right now. And we look at isolated problems and try to remediate an immediate issue rather than looking at a greater context and the implications and the ramifications of the choices that we make.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point that you make. I think one of the challenges is, for instance, the rights of nature concept, I think, can be inspirational, and in some cases it can be practical. But in some cases, if folks here in Utah focus simply on the rights of nature piece, I'm not discounting what you say, but the actual the leverage to make change to address this immediate problem is something that rights of nature can play a role, but it's also going to take lawyers. It's also going to take a lot of economic analysis to make the change. And that's why whenever we do a film screening, it's always really interesting to talk with the audience about how they feel that idea could be implemented in their own communities. I find that maybe one of the most fascinating pieces, because it's a question of human ingenuity. You have this tool, and what is the best way to use that? What is the best way to use that tool for the issue at hand? And so, for instance, last night when we talked about the lake, others were saying, shouldn't the rights of nature be applied to the Bear River, because the Bear River is the major tributary? And let's say you had a rights of nature for the entire lake, but if you don't have it for the Bear River, you really don't have the water. And so the group Save Our Great Salt Lake is there. I think they're in discussion now with as many stakeholders as possible to decide whether or not they feel they should shift their emphasis to the Bear River, or whether it should be a broader piece, how that should be structured. So I think your questions are the kinds of questions all of us should be asking anytime we get engaged with one of these issues, because you could have a, let's just say, another example is in the Fort Myers area. So before the hurricane, they had a terrible nutrient pollution problem there, meaning agricultural runoff from Central Florida. It's creating a lot of red tides, among other problems. And to say, just to declare the St. Myers area and the bay there, under the rights of nature legislation, wouldn't solve the problem, because the nutrients are coming down from all the agriculture in Central Florida. So as you're saying, it really requires a more integrated approach, but sometimes whether it's a community, a region, a state, a group of people, you just got to get a foot in the door and establish something, and then try to build that.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned is economic analysis. And we have a long history of trying to commodify nature and even life itself. I mean, if you look at the insurance industry, right, is commodifying
Right.
everything. And when we think about trying to assign a dollar value to things, that in itself can be problematic. But when we look at the larger scope, in order to assign a more accurate value, we need to be looking at the broader picture as well. Like you're just saying, is it the lake or is it the river, and what's happening upriver, and what is the cost of that river being polluted, and what ecosystems is it affecting, and how about the communities and the lifestyle of the people? And we don't have ways to commodify those things. We haven't traditionally tried to value those things consciously, right? So if we look at, for instance, the cost of a pipeline, we don't necessarily include the costs to communities along the pipeline. We don't necessarily include the risks when there are spills, or how it's affecting local fish populations, or the ground, or the ability to grow things. We look instead at the cost of the materials that are building the thing.
Yeah. I had two thoughts as you were speaking. One is in terms of this. I mean, there's the hydrologic cycle, of course, and the Utah's ski areas are, most of them are downwind. Most of the storms that come into Utah in the winter come from the west or the northwest. There are some, of course, that come up from the south, but most come from the north or northwest, meaning they blow across the lake. And they pick up water there, and then as those storm clouds climb up over the mountains, the temperature drops, the air has less water carrying capacity, and it drops the snow on the mountain. So they estimate anywhere between 5 and 10% of the snowpack in the ski areas comes from lake effect snow. So there is sort of, even though it's not entirely a rights of nature perspective, there's a recognition of this hydrologic cycle and the economic cost of, a significant interruption to that cycle. Another interesting example, and you mentioned fish, is, and I don't think this is a rights of nature. I don't think the lever has been the rights of nature, though that has certainly been a significant part of the conversation in the Columbia River watershed, right? Having to do with the salmon runs, the importance of salmon in the indigenous communities. But I believe I had read that there's a fairly strong movement now to possibly take out some of those dams on the Columbia because of the catastrophic cost of the dams, right? I mean, it will cost more to ship grain from the farms in central Washington, for instance, but the cost to the fisheries, who don't, this fish are unable to really get up the river despite all the fish ladders and the efforts of fisheries biologists and so forth. So I haven't followed up on that story, but I remember reading it a few months ago, and I thought that was quite an interesting, quite a turn of events. And I would say, sort of in terms of human psychology, generally people, I mean, there are a few people who early on say, I'm going to stop doing this because it's bad for me. But often it takes some sort of catastrophic health event for a person to say, wow, I better stop smoking, for instance. My grandfather, who died the year before I was born, was a 2-pack a day smoker. And he had a very stressful job, and I don't know if maybe they knew smoking was bad for them, but it was certainly a lot more widespread than it is today. And I don't think it was until he had his first heart attack that he stopped smoking. And then, a few years later, he had a fatal heart attack. But I often think of that as sort of emblematic of our relationship to nature as a whole. It's not until we're confronted with something on the brink of collapse that we think, wow, we better stop and do something. And that is certainly manifest in what we're seeing here with the Great Salt Lake, with the salmon fisheries and the Columbia River, and dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of other places around the globe.
Yes, I agree. I want to ask you about making the film, because you got to travel all over the world and witness situations, talk to people. I'm wondering, I'm sure you have many stories, but I'm wondering if maybe there's one particular story that just stands out for you that you would like to share with us.
Gosh,
I know that's a hard ask.
that is a hard one. I'll sort of make a hybrid story. How about that?
That'd be great.
In that, I think as a tourist, it's often difficult to make what I would consider meaningful connections with local people. There's this sort of artificial barrier, despite the hospitality of locals. But in doing this film, we were very dependent on people's help. And I think once they met us, it was Isaac, Isaac's wife, and me and Val in South America, and then just the three of us in Ecuador, and then Isaac, his wife, and me in New Zealand. I think once people heard our story, they were willing to tell their story. And so that took a significant measure of trust, actually, that we could get people to talk to us. And then once there were a few key people who had talked to us and felt they really enjoyed having the conversation, they picked up the phone and called other people that we had been unable to get any communication with. And so it was a very, I guess, affirming experience insofar as able to make these connections and feel like we were doing something useful, telling these stories that really deserved to be told, and in the process learning quite a bit about the history and current situation in a number of these countries and communities. One example, for instance, would be the guy Chris Finlayson, who features in the film. He was the minister for the Treaty of Waitangi negotiation. He'd also been the Attorney General for New Zealand for a long time, and he was very generous with us. We went to his offices in Parliament. He took us out for dinner. He connected us with all sorts of people, and was also helpful in getting some of the items that we needed from TV New Zealand. Post-production, they wanted like $10,000 for this clip. We really needed to tell the story, and our entire budget for the film was probably $10,000. I said, Chris, we can't make the film without it. He literally just picked up the phone and said they'll give it to you for $500, whatever. And so that sort of generosity has made me want to be very generous, with my time in terms of telling the story, talking to as many groups as possible. It's really sort of what was I going to say? I was trying to use the word sharing in here somehow. It's been a lesson in sharing. Yeah, like the gift that keeps on giving. Right. Mm-hmm.
It makes me think. You said gaining trust. And the way that you gained trust was by sharing your stories. So
yeah,
you were trusting them with your story, and through that became trustworthy, and they gave you trust. And I think that that's such an important thing for us to be consciously alert to, that when we extend ourselves to one another, people are inclined to extend themselves in return.
Yes. Yeah. I really feel that often, in terms of trying to solve a problem, and ultimately an environmental issues are a form of problem, that story and listening is so important, because what on the surface may seem like the problem is often much deeper. It could be a historical grievance that runs generations.
Yeah.
It could be fear of a loss of livelihood. It could be a fear of being exposed to toxic pollution, but maybe not feeling culturally that it's okay to express that fear. And so I feel like anytime we have these discussions, about the film or other environmental issues in Utah, I feel it's so important to listen to people and do. It's sort of a cliche, to try to listen, but to put aside the prejudices that people have about one another or about that group, because those concerns are very real to those people, and no amount of telling them they're wrong is going to change that. The only way to enact change is to find out not just what the concerns are, but what are the root causes of those concerns, and then try to come up with a solution that is, the proverbial win-win.
Is getting people to be working together on the same team.
Right. And with a measure of respect for one another.
Exactly.
In which the people can feel that they can be themselves and share what is most important to them without feeling like they have to be on the defensive. And I see that almost every day in my own work. When people are upset about something, often what they say they're upset about isn't what they're upset about.
100%.
And you can find that key. It's just magical. It unlocks it, and then all of a sudden this door opens up, and the solution is right there.
That was so beautifully said. And so I really feel like there's a theme going through our conversation about identifying problems.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a much more nuanced process than what might be obvious. Just whether it's with people, whether it's environmentally, whether it's legislatively, whether it's ecologically, that we get to create a greater context.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm all about paradigm shifting. So being able to see that kind of pattern in our conversation is heartening to me. I just want to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the shuffle,
Right. And I think for people who are interested in this concept, the rights of nature idea, the process could be something such as, what is the problem that I most want to solve, and sort of going through those layers of analysis to figure out what, not just, okay, here's the problem, but what is the root cause of the problem. So right. I don't mean to keep talking about Great Salt Lake, but just because I was at an event last night.
Great example.
So the issue wasn't that people didn't want to put more water in the lake. It was that the legal structure prohibited that. And so once we were able to change the legal structure, that opens the door to getting more water in the lake. And there are just, hundreds of examples like this. It could be a political obstacle. It could be a legal obstacle. It could be some long animosity between groups that perceive each other as rivals. And when you and I talked before, I don't remember if I'd mentioned this, but either in the Utah Water book or the Utah Air Quality book, I said that generally when you speak with people, they want the same things, that they want a safe community, they want clean air, they want clean water, they want good schools for their kids. There are very few people you'd stop on the street, regardless of their political leanings, who say, I'm for polluted water.
Right.
But it's often how those ideas get discussed, and that's where the divisions arise. And I feel like if we're able to put aside some of the language that divides us, on both sides, if people are able to put aside their differences, because typically I think people's their ideas are bundled. and so they might feel like, gosh, I really am in favor of clean air, but the people who seem to be advocating most loudly for clean air are anti-X and I am pro-X, and they have a hard time sort of disassociating one idea out from the other. So I've found that, of course, in troubleshooting, it's really important to try and find that common ground, and to disassociate the ideas that are certainly creating the friction and the tension, but that they may have very little to do with the issue at hand.
I think that's a brilliant insight. Really brilliant, because we do conflate different ideas that don't necessarily belong together at all, and make judgments based on that conflation, if that's a word even.
It is.
Okay, good. Good. So, one of the things that fascinates me, and I'd love to hear more about it, you talk about in-field training or in-field learning.
Yes.
And I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
Great. So that's often, sometimes the term is experiential education. So a student isn't simply in a classroom, but they're out. The way I always see it is they're engaging all of their senses. So I mean, okay, in a classroom, you're listening and you're watching, but I think the other senses, the touch, the taste, the smell, at least in humanities classrooms, is generally lacking. Now, let's say you're in the arts and you're doing dance. Of course, that's not true. If you're a geologist on a field trip, that's not true. But it's very unusual, say, for a philosophy class or a literature class, to take students outdoors. 30 years ago, I mean, if a literature class, if you went on a field trip, it might be to visit the home of an author. Maybe if you were living in Massachusetts, you'd go to Walden Pond near in Concord, Massachusetts. But I really felt that the students, they engage with not just the concept at hand, but everything when they're able to go into the field. And so for years, I used to teach a class in Dinosaur National Monument, which is on the Colorado-Utah border. It's where the Yampa River and the Green River flow together in a place called Dinosaur National Monument, which was, by the way, one of the major conservation battles in the 1950s. They wanted to put a dam in there, and David Brower of the Sierra Club fought that tooth and nail, with the compromise that he wasn't going to protest the damming of Glen Canyon, which he later in his life said that was one of his deepest regrets in his life, that he didn't fight that. But in any case, the work of Wallace Stegner and other conservationists at the time preserve this, and it's a magnificent landscape if you can ever come to Utah to go see it, especially like on a raft. But anyway, I would take students over there and we would camp out for 5 or 6 nights, and we would look at the history of the region, the farming and ranching history, the indigenous history, the geology, everything that is a question of place. And I think when you can feel the climate on your skin and smell the plants, feel the river, it's a completely transformative experience. And so this was a long time ago that I did that book, but teaching in the field, working with students in the outdoor classroom, provided educators with ideas for how they could take students outdoors. Now, not everybody lives close to a national monument in a sparsely populated state such as Utah. Most people are teaching in an urban area. But there's a chapter in there on urban nature that just talks about the ways in which taking students even outdoors, and even looking at just some plants that happen to be in a park or in a curb strip or something can really provide a really rich experience. And so that was a fun project, and people still buy the book. I mean, it's not like I could ever make a living from it, but it's fun to see in the statement I get from the press every year that people still seem to be interested in purchasing the book.
What did you notice different in terms of the students, their experience, their engagement, their actual learning and retention?
I think one of the regrets I have as an educator is that so much of what we do is in the classroom, in a building. And as a person who enjoys being outdoors for all those holistic reasons that you had spoken of earlier, I just feel like we're sort of cheating the students, but that's just how we do it, right? I mean, the ideal way to really engage students in an idea would be if they could, get out for a week at a time, 2 weeks at a time. But of course, people have lives and they're doing sports and they're performing in the orchestra and so forth. And so that's how we do it in the classroom. But I think that when students are able to get away from their everyday life, and really focus on a place and let the place focus on them, it becomes immersive, and they connect with each other in ways that are very difficult in a classroom, where you're in there for 50 minutes and they get a few minutes to get to the next class, and they can't be themselves. I feel like, again, if you're teaching dance, you're getting, I think, to have a chance to interact with students in a physical way, as opposed to purely, say, in an intellectual way. And so when you're in the field with the students, you get a sense of their hopes and their dreams, their fears, but also their skills and their abilities in a way that the classroom doesn't permit that to show. So some people might be magnificent cooks or musicians or fly fishers or whatever it is. And I feel like you can really get to know the students as a person as opposed to a student. And I really think of the longer term connections that I've had with students have all come from these the sessions that I've done in the field with the students. And I think they have a profound impact on the students as well.
It sounds like it breaks down the compartmentalization that school and traditional education is very much about, where you have this class in this classroom with this teacher, and then you go to the next class and you go to the next one. And here you're creating a life experience where people are actually in relationship to each other and their surroundings and whatever they're learning. That education isn't separated from life. Hello.
Yeah.
Wow, right? Yeah. Life is learning. But our systems aren't set up that way. So this conversation that you've just opened up for me is a whole new potential for education. And there's a whole different level of socialization that occurs in that kind of context that school doesn't, in its traditional form, support, really.
Very well said. Exactly.
Interesting. It's so fascinating, because I do believe life is learning, and the way that we learn so influences the way that we live, right? Whereas, wouldn't it be better if the way that we live influences the way we learn? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to encourage everybody. I realize we haven't mentioned the name of your film since the intro, and it's Rights of Nature, a Global Movement. And where can people see your film?
It's on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. Typically, if you just do a search for the Rights of Nature, a Global Movement, that will bring you to some third-party website. A number of conservation organizations have used the film as sort of a way to get clicks to their website. There's nothing wrong with that. You can, if you go to YouTube, though, that's generally the best way. Go to YouTube as opposed to starting from a Google search. If you go to YouTube and then put in the title of the film, you'll see it. And there's two there. There's a trailer, about 2 minutes, and then the film itself, which is 52 minutes. And then there's also a Spanish language version as well.
Awesome. And I do want to let everybody know it's a beautiful film and really powerful. So please, I encourage you to check it out. And do you want to give us a way people can find you, Hal?
Sure, you can probably the easiest way is via email. So my email is hcrimmel, Crimmel, at weber.edu, weber.edu. Or you can just you can Google me. I'm sure that I'm fairly easy to find on the internet. Hal Crimmel.
That's awesome.
I'd love to hear from you. It's always fun to connect with new people. In the last 2 months or so, I've connected with a lot, in part through Mira, but also through a couple of these other organizations. And it's just really fun to meet like-minded people and to learn actually how much is going on in this space. Just really briefly, there was a conference, not a conference, really a symposium here in Salt Lake, maybe 2-3 weeks ago. And I met so many interesting, wonderful people, including 2 people who live up in my home region, which is called the North Country, north of the Adirondacks, south of Ottawa, south of Montreal, but on the New York State side. And they are pushing for rights of nature for 2 of the rivers there, the Grass River and the Racket River, and also for rights of nature for the St. Lawrence River watershed. So it was just so fantastic to meet these people just by chance. Of the hundreds of people at this symposium, I almost fell over, and they said they were living in this tiny little hamlet near where I grew up, in a region that I really care about. And I've always felt that it was worthy of protection, but it probably wasn't something that was going to become a national park, for instance. So it's really neat to see that idea sort of come full circle to this place I really care about. And I hope that all of you listening, maybe there are places you feel similarly about, and there are others who do, and you might be able to make some connections and see where you can go with this, even if it's only 100 yards of a creek. There's a creek here in Salt Lake City that was going to get paved over, and an elementary school teacher happened to be there with her 4th grade kids, and they were like, this would be a tragedy if this were paved over. And they wrote stories and drew pictures, and they saved this. It's probably 75 yards of creek, but right in an urban area. And it's just it's a wonderful story of like the power of everyday people, kids,
That's
to
such an
save
important
something
reminder.
in the future. Yeah.
Yes, it's such an important reminder to know that we all can have an impact.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be big and grand and loud, but we can all make a difference.
Yeah.
So we're going to put a link to your film on our website and your books. And I'm wondering if there are organizations that you can name for folks that want to get involved in the rights of nature movement. And we'll put links to those on the website as well. Okay.
Yeah, maybe why don't I send you, Amira, why don't I send you an email on that? But a couple could be, one is called GARN, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. That's one of the major ones. CELDF, Community Environmental Defense Fund, Community Environmental Defense League, CELDF. Then there's the group out of Durango called I'm going to forget the name now, but they're a Rights of Nature group. If you Googled Rights of Nature, Durango, Colorado, they used to be in the Bay Area, and now they've relocated to Colorado. It'll come to me, the name, when I don't think of it. There's also a group, a Rights of Nature. I mean, the Rights of Nature groups are everywhere. I mean, you just Google it, and
that's good news.
It's likely there's one in your community, and I've been surprised how many there are simply by Googling that. Rights of Nature Florida, Rights of Nature California, Southern California, Idaho. There are lots of rights of nature initiatives that people have tried and they haven't ultimately passed, but there are lots of people interested in this right now. So those are a few organizations just off the top of my head.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I realize I mentioned our website, but I didn't mention the website address, which is sustainabilitynow.global rather than .com. And we will have links for all of these things. Hal, I know we're coming up to the end of our time together. I so appreciate your being with us. I'm wondering if there's something I should have asked you that I didn't ask.
I think we covered an awful lot of ground, everything from the way individuals can get involved, to the hopefulness of this movement, to just some general ideas for connecting with others. Certainly we could talk more as well about all sorts of things, but I think hope, connection, focus, some measure of practicality, a mix of these things. As I always say, it takes people on this entire spectrum, people who are out there advocating for these ideas that today seem really far-fetched, and people who on the other end are down in the really nuts and bolts, bare knuckle world of politics, trying to get these ideas that 10 years ago seemed like they were an outlier, it codified and become sort of part of our everyday. And so I always say when I do a talk, that every single person plays a role, much in the way that every species plays a role in a healthy ecosystem. So if we think of ourselves as sort of an ecosystem for advocacy, everyone plays a role, whether you're an attorney, an accountant, a PR person, a homemaker, a teacher. There's a role for each of us. So that's a really wonderful piece, I think.
I love that. Thank you. Ecosystem for advocacy. That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and thank all of you who are listening and sharing this. Please, if you enjoyed this, please share it widely. And we just want to say thank you. We all can be carrying the torch here together, and everybody has the ability and influence to make a difference. So that's it for today. Live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.